January 7, 1945. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower sat alone in his headquarters with a typed transcript spread across his desk like a crime scene report. The room was quiet, but his hands weren't. They trembled as he read, shaking not from fear, not from fatigue, but from a cold, controlled anger that kept tightening in his chest with every line. Bernard Montgomery had just stood before the world's press and told them a story that made British leadership the hero and American sacrifice the supporting cast. He claimed he had saved the American army during the Battle of the Bulge. He described arriving to find confusion everywhere, units scattered, command relationships tangled, and then like a man stepping onto a stage, he presented himself as the one who brought order, steadiness, and victory. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a verdict. The implication was brutal. The Americans had been brave, yes, but badly led. Rescued by British method and British judgment before disaster swallowed the Western Front. Eisenhower read it again, slower this time, because disbelief can be a kind of denial. Every sentence felt like a deliberate twist of the knife. Montgomery's language didn't simply claim credit. It pushed blame. It suggested that without British intervention, the German breakthrough might have succeeded and the Americans might have broken. It made American commanders sound panicked, their soldiers sound lost, their victory sound borrowed. Eisenhower had spent his entire command life doing the unglamorous work that kept coalitions intact. Smoothing egos, absorbing insults, praising allies he privately disagreed with, and making sure the war didn't become a competition between flags. He had overseen North Africa, Sicily, and the vast machinery of Normandy. He had managed the most complicated alliance on earth while the enemy tried to split it with every surprise and every propaganda line. And now, with one press conference, Montgomery had poured gasoline on the most dangerous fire a coalition can face. Wounded pride. Eisenhower set the pages down and stared at the desk as if the wood might provide an answer. He knew what came next without needing a briefing. His senior American commanders were going to explode. Their officers were going to demand action. Their soldiers, still numb from the cold of the Ardennes, still burying friends who froze in foxholes, were going to feel betrayed. Eisenhower reached for the phone because he could already see the dominoes. If he didn't act, those commanders would threaten resignation. If they resigned, the American chain of command could fracture. If the American chain fractured, the alliance itself could crack in a way Germany couldn't manage with tanks. This, Eisenhower realized, was the special curse of being Supreme Allied Commander. Authority over almost everyone except the one subordinate whose removal could trigger a political earthquake. To understand why a firing that looked so simple on paper could become impossible in practice, you have to go back to October 1942, when Bernard Montgomery stepped into the Desert War and became something bigger than a general. At the Battle of El Alamein, the British Eighth Army had been battered and humiliated for years, pushed back and forth across the sands by the German commander Erwin Rommel. Britain had endured Dunkirk, the fall of France, the Blitz, the grinding fear that its empire and its future were shrinking. Then Montgomery arrived with his sharp confidence and his obsession with preparation. He stockpiled supplies, drilled his troops, and planned as though he could engineer victory the way an architect designs a bridge. When he finally attacked in late October, he broke through Rommel's lines and forced a retreat that felt like a national resurrection. It wasn't merely a battlefield success. It was a psychological turning point. Church bells rang across Britain, and Montgomery's face became a symbol of competence in a nation hungry for it. Fame wrapped around Montgomery like armor. He cultivated an image, the odd beret with 2 badges, the clean living, the quotable speeches, the certainty that never wavered. The public loved him because he seemed to embody something Britain desperately needed to believe, that discipline and will could still beat the Reich. But inside that certainty grew something sharper. Montgomery didn't merely think he was good. He began to think he was the only one who truly understood war. He wrote privately about other generals as if they were children playing with matches, about politicians as nuisances, about disagreement as proof of stupidity or jealousy. Confidence hardened into arrogance, and arrogance hardened into the kind of pride that demands the world mirror it back. By the time the war shifted into Northwest Europe, Montgomery had become a field marshal, the highest rank in the British Army, and he commanded the 21st Army Group, British and Canadian forces that mattered not only militarily but symbolically. On paper, he reported to Eisenhower. In practice, he often behaved as if he were Eisenhower's equal, and sometimes his superior. And everyone in the Allied High Command understood the explosive truth. Firing Montgomery wasn't just a personnel action. It wasn't a simple relief of command. It was a political detonation. Eisenhower's job was never purely military. It was diplomatic warfare with uniforms. Britain by that stage contributed a smaller share of the total forces in Western Europe than the United States. But it demanded influence far beyond the raw numbers. Britain had been fighting since 1939, and Churchill intended to ensure Britain's prestige remained intact, even as American manpower and industry increasingly dominated the battlefield. Churchill was not going to allow Britain to look like a junior partner. He insisted that British commanders be treated as equals. And he defended Montgomery with the intensity of a man protecting not only a general but the national narrative that general represented. This was reinforced by the alliance structure itself. Strategic decisions required cooperation between American and British leadership. If Eisenhower acted against Montgomery without Churchill's consent, Churchill could appeal over Eisenhower's head, turning a firing into an international crisis. Roosevelt had made his own priorities clear. Unity mattered more than perfection. The war had to be won, and the alliance had to survive it because the world that followed would demand cooperation against a different kind of threat. Eisenhower understood that his authority came with invisible strings. He could command armies, but he could not ignore the politics that supplied them. For a long time, Eisenhower managed Montgomery the way a careful hand manages a lit match near gasoline, with distance, with patience, with constant attention. He smiled when he wanted to argue. He praised when he wanted to reprimand. He learned to endure Montgomery's habit of pushing, then blaming, then pushing again. The pattern became almost predictable. Montgomery would demand resources, insist his plan was the decisive one, receive support, and then, if results fell short, point outward in every direction except the mirror. In the early autumn of 1944, Montgomery presented Operation Market Garden as the grand solution. Airborne divisions would drop deep into the Netherlands, seize bridges in a rapid chain, and create a narrow corridor for armored forces to race into Germany. Montgomery promised it could end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower had doubts. Intelligence suggested strong German forces near Arnhem. The plan relied on a single elevated highway surrounded by enemy territory. And if one bridge held, the whole corridor could be choked like a throat. But Montgomery pressed hard, arguing that his concentrated thrust under British direction was superior to Eisenhower's broad front approach. He demanded priority for supplies. He hinted he would take his case to Churchill if he was denied. Eisenhower approved, in part because he could not afford a British rupture at that moment. Resources were shifted. Air power was committed. American airborne divisions were placed under Montgomery's operational control. And then the operation collapsed. Casualties piled up in the thousands. The British 1st Airborne Division was shattered. The war did not end by Christmas. It was dragged into the bitter winter. When it was over, Montgomery did not publicly take responsibility for overpromising and underestimating. He blamed weather, intelligence, delays, the Dutch resistance, anyone who could absorb the blame without forcing him to. After Market Garden, Montgomery returned to his favorite argument, that Eisenhower's broad front strategy was wrong, that only a single thrust under unified command, meaning of course his command, could deliver victory. He wrote and spoke in ways that suggested British experience was superior to American energy. Eisenhower refused to abandon the broad front. Multiple armies would advance, stretching German defenses, preventing the enemy from concentrating against one spearhead. Montgomery protested to Churchill, and Churchill predictably shielded him. Eisenhower kept working around the damage, giving Montgomery enough to satisfy British pride while preventing Montgomery from controlling American armies. And then, in mid-December of 1944, Hitler launched the last gamble. The German counteroffensive through the Ardennes that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. In the grey cold of December, German forces smashed into a weakly held sector of the American line with surprise and mass. Their goal was audacious: split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, fracture the coalition, and force a political settlement before Germany's remaining strength bled out. It was desperate, but desperation can be dangerous when it strikes the right seam. American units were hit hard, but they did not collapse. They fought delaying actions, retreated with discipline, and formed new lines under brutal conditions. The defense around Bastogne became a legend of endurance. An American airborne division surrounded in freezing woods, holding a road junction because the war demanded it. Eisenhower reacted quickly, shifting divisions, pulling forces from quiet sectors, and ordering Patton's Third Army to pivot and strike north. It was a massive, risky movement in winter, and it required speed and will. The alliance held. But the northern sector of the battlefield created a practical command problem. Communications were broken, the front was distorted, and coordination across boundaries became chaotic. Eisenhower made a temporary decision. He placed 2 American armies in the northern sector under Montgomery's coordination, not as a reward, but as an expedient, a short-term measure to organize defense in that area. The intent was simple: stabilize, counterattack, and then return those forces to American command once the emergency passed. Montgomery interpreted it differently. To him, it looked like validation, proof that Eisenhower had finally conceded what Montgomery had believed all along, that British command was steadier, more professional, more suited for crisis. Montgomery began to behave as if the temporary arrangement reflected a permanent truth. Meanwhile, the battle was won by American blood. American soldiers froze in foxholes. American units held the line and counterattacked. Patton's relief of Bastogne became one of the war's most remarkable maneuvers, a hard turn of an entire army into the teeth of winter to break a siege. By early January of 1945, the German offensive was exhausted and failing. The Bulge began to shrink as Allied counterattacks ground forward. Germany had burned some of its last reserves. The road to defeat was now inescapable. And that was the moment Montgomery chose to speak. On January 7, 1945, with the snow still packed into the tracks of tanks and the graves still fresh, Montgomery scheduled a press conference. His staff warned him against it. The battle had barely ended. American anger was still raw. The public narrative was delicate. This was not the time to claim credit. Montgomery ignored them. He believed the world needed to hear what really happened. And in his version, the key fact was not American endurance but British leadership. He described arriving to find confusion. He described taking charge, organizing, and stopping the Germans. He praised American courage in a way that sounded like a father praising a child for trying hard, while implying the child would have drowned without adult supervision. He spoke as if he had rescued the Americans from disaster. And he used the moment to resurrect his strategic argument, that a concentrated thrust under unified command would be the proper way to end the war, subtly suggesting Eisenhower's approach had helped create the crisis in the first place. The effect was immediate. British audiences largely heard pride. American audiences heard theft and insult. The story traveled fast. American newspapers reported that Montgomery claimed to have saved the United States Army. Editorials flared. Veterans demanded answers. Members of Congress asked why a British general was permitted to belittle American troops. But the most dangerous reaction didn't come from newspapers or politicians. It came from the men who commanded millions of American soldiers in Europe and who could, with a single decision, turn the alliance's internal tension into open fracture. 2 days later, on January 9, 1945, General Omar Bradley walked into Eisenhower's headquarters with a message that turned the crisis from ugly to catastrophic. Bradley was not a dramatic man. He was careful, methodical, disciplined. When he spoke, people listened because he did not waste words on emotion. He told Eisenhower that if Montgomery was not removed from command, Bradley would resign. And if Bradley resigned, George Patton would resign with him. Eisenhower felt the temperature of the room drop. Bradley explained that he could not command American armies under a structure that allowed a foreign commander to publicly humiliate American soldiers and claim credit for American victories. The officers were furious. Morale was souring into something worse than anger, distrust. Patton's view was even more blunt. Patton had just driven Third Army through winter conditions to relieve Bastogne, a maneuver that demanded speed, discipline, and audacity. His men had fought in bitter cold, often without adequate winter gear, and they had done it anyway. And now Montgomery had stood before microphones and suggested those men needed British rescue. Patton called it an ungracious insult, one that could not go unanswered. Eisenhower was trapped between two disasters. If he sided with Bradley and Patton, he would have to fire Montgomery, triggering a political storm with Churchill and potentially shaking the alliance. If he refused, his senior American commanders could resign, fracturing the American command structure and possibly forcing Eisenhower's own removal. He considered middle ground, public statements clarifying contributions, private reprimands, quiet changes in command arrangements. Bradley and Patton said it was not enough. Montgomery had insulted American honor in public. A private scolding would satisfy no one. Either Montgomery had to be removed, or at minimum stripped of authority over American troops in any future operation. After they left, Eisenhower sat alone with a decision that looked on paper like a simple act of authority. He had the legal power to relieve Montgomery for conduct damaging to the alliance. The press conference qualified. Eisenhower began drafting the relief order, writing the language carefully. Insubordination. Undermining confidence. Damaging unity. When it was done, it lay on his desk, one signature away from changing history. If he signed, Montgomery would be sent home. Bradley and Patton would stay. American pride would be defended. The alliance would endure the shock. Or it would not. Before the pen touched paper, the phone rang. London. Urgent. A message from Winston Churchill. Churchill understood crisis the way sailors understand storms. He could smell it before the sky fully darkened. He had learned quickly that American commanders were demanding Montgomery's removal, and he knew what that meant. He called Eisenhower directly. The tone was tense but controlled. Two men speaking as allies while guarding their own political landmines. Churchill acknowledged the damage. He admitted Montgomery had been tactless, that the press conference could be read as insulting. But then he made his real argument. Firing Montgomery would create a backlash far worse than the press conference itself. Montgomery was not just a commander. He was Britain's most visible military figure. Removing him would look like America forcing Britain to sacrifice its hero to soothe wounded pride. Churchill warned that British public opinion could turn. He implied carefully that if Montgomery were fired, Churchill might have to defend him publicly, and that such a defense would strain the alliance at the worst possible time. Eisenhower listened, then answered with his own reality. American soldiers were furious. American commanders were at the edge of resignation. American public opinion was boiling. Eisenhower could not ignore those pressures any more than Churchill could ignore Britain's. Something had to change. Churchill proposed a compromise that was less a solution than an emergency patch. What if Montgomery apologized? Not a humiliating public apology, Churchill suggested, but a private letter, one that expressed regret, acknowledged misunderstanding, praised American forces, and gave Eisenhower a way to calm the Americans without detonating British politics. Eisenhower did not agree immediately. He said he would consult Bradley and Patton. He could not promise the letter would be enough, but he listened because he had to. The relief order remained on the desk, still unsigned, still waiting like a loaded weapon. Eisenhower was searching for any outcome that kept the alliance intact while preventing the American command from breaking. Churchill made his next move quickly. He reached into Montgomery's own headquarters through the man closest to him, his chief of staff. The message was blunt. Fly immediately. Make Montgomery understand how close he is to disaster, and force him to write the letter that might save his command. When Montgomery's chief of staff arrived with the warning, Montgomery greeted him casually, still convinced his press conference had been a triumph. He believed he had finally secured proper credit for British contributions. He did not understand at first why anyone would be upset. Then the truth was put in front of him. Eisenhower had drafted an order relieving him of command. The order existed. It was ready. It was waiting for one signature. Montgomery's confidence finally wavered. He argued about prestige, about Britain's position, about facts. His chief of staff cut through it with the impatience of a man trying to stop a fire from reaching ammunition. Prestige didn't matter. Position didn't matter. Only the alliance mattered. If Montgomery didn't write a letter immediately, something that gave Eisenhower a way out, Eisenhower could sign the order and send him home in disgrace. The headline would not be heroic. It would be humiliating. Montgomery would be remembered not as Britain's savior but as the general whose ego nearly shattered the coalition. For Montgomery, the letter was painful. He was not practiced at admitting error. His identity was built on being right. But reality was pressing in from all sides, and the people who once shielded him were now forcing him to bend. Drafts were written and rewritten, lines adjusted to sound sincere without sounding like surrender. The final version did what it needed to do. It expressed regret that his remarks had caused misunderstanding. It acknowledged that his words might be interpreted as failing to give proper credit to American forces. It praised the courage and determination of American soldiers in the Ardennes. It pledged cooperation with Eisenhower and American commanders going forward. It did not fully retract his claims, and it did not confess wrongdoing outright, but it created a bridge, thin, imperfect, but usable. The letter was delivered to Eisenhower at once. Eisenhower read it carefully, then handed it to Bradley and Patton. The moment of decision returned, sharper than before. Was this enough? Was this face-saving language sufficient to stop resignation threats and keep the alliance from unraveling? Bradley read the letter like a man reading terms of surrender. He noted what was present and what was missing. Regret for misunderstanding is not the same as admitting fault. Praise for American soldiers is not the same as retracting the insult. Patton was openly disgusted. He called the letter worthless. Polished garbage meant to protect Montgomery without honoring the men who froze and died. Patton wanted Montgomery fired. Politics be damned. Bradley, however, carried the weight of a different calculation. He understood the political disaster firing could ignite. He understood the strategic stakes of unity in the final months. He also understood that Eisenhower needed an exit from an impossible corridor. Bradley said he would accept the letter on a condition. Montgomery's temporary authority over American armies must end immediately. And Montgomery must never again command American troops operationally. American forces would return to American command. The boundary would be restored, clear and non-negotiable. Patton hated it, but he recognized what Bradley was doing, offering Eisenhower a way to keep the alliance intact without surrendering American pride completely. Patton agreed reluctantly, making it clear he never wanted to serve under Montgomery again. Eisenhower made his choice. He took the relief order from the desk and destroyed it. The signature would never be written. Instead, he issued the changes Bradley demanded. American armies returned to American command. Montgomery's authority over them ended. Eisenhower accepted the letter with a cold, professional conversation that carried a warning beneath every polite phrase. Trust had been damaged. Cooperation would exist only where military necessity required it. The era of Montgomery freely leveraging Churchill's backing to pressure strategy and resources was over. The crisis ended without a public rupture. But something fundamental had shifted. Eisenhower had learned that Montgomery's political protection was not absolute, yet it was powerful enough to make a firing costlier than any battlefield error. Montgomery had learned, perhaps for the first time, that he was not untouchable. He had been one signature away from disgrace, and only a narrow compromise kept him in command. Bradley and Patton stayed, but their respect for the Allied command structure had been cut and scarred. They had watched their supreme commander forced into a solution that felt like a diplomatic bandage on a deep wound. The war continued. Germany's defeat approached like a closing door that could no longer be held open. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. Cameras captured smiles. Speeches celebrated unity. To the public, the alliance looked seamless. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower was relieved that he would never again have to manage Montgomery in wartime. Montgomery posed for photographs, accepted surrender in his sector, and carried his reputation forward as if the crisis had been a minor misunderstanding rather than a near catastrophe. In the years that followed, Montgomery insisted in memoirs and interviews that his strategic vision had been correct all along, that the war could have ended earlier if Eisenhower had listened. But German commanders interviewed after the war confirmed the harsh logic Eisenhower had relied on. The broad front advance prevented Germany from concentrating its defenses against a single spearhead. Historians weighed the logistics and concluded that Montgomery's single-thrust dreams were often constrained by supply reality. Eisenhower had been right about strategy, but the Montgomery problem had never been purely strategic. It was political. It was symbolic. It was the dangerous truth that in coalition war, you can have formal authority and still lack freedom. So why couldn't Eisenhower simply fire him when the order was already drafted? Because the price was not measured only in rank and paperwork. It was measured in alliance stability, public opinion, national pride, and Churchill's willingness to turn a commander's relief into a political battle that could poison cooperation at the edge of victory. Eisenhower chose unity over satisfaction. He chose to manage the problem rather than solve it cleanly because solving it might have shattered the structure holding the Western Front together. Years later, President Harry Truman would fire General Douglas MacArthur for insubordination, proving that sometimes the political cost can be paid when the stakes demand it. Eisenhower faced a different kind of war with a different kind of balance, and he made the opposite calculation. He won the war without breaking the alliance. But he lived with the knowledge that the one subordinate who most deserved removal had survived. Not because he was innocent, not because he was correct, but because he was protected by politics, prestige, and the fragile mathematics of coalition victory. And that is the final irony of supreme command. You can have the power to sign an order and still be unable to sign.